Good afternoon, everybody, and happy Thursday to you all. Welcome again to another episode of Edible Software, and today we are going to be covering payables and AP reports. So it's going to be kind of a short one today. We're just covering the reports that are listed here under AP reports, skipping, of course, consignment liquidation because that is going to be its own that is going to be its own training. So we're going to skip that for today, but we're going to be covering pretty much everything else. So let's just go ahead and get through it. So, first things first, aged payables. So, aged payables is definitely the best report to use when you are comparing to your AP account at the end of your fiscal period or at the end of the month. So, when you're balancing out reports and your general ledger, you'll be comparing to this report. So, of course, we have the ability to filter by any of these options here. Of course, if you are comparing to your AP account at the or your accounts payable account at the end of your fiscal period, you won't be messing with any filter options. You'll pretty much leave everything as is, and then run as of the same date that you were running your general ledger. However, if you are running this report simply to see payables for certain vendors or for certain vendor groups, of course, we have the ability to filter by any of those options here. You can also specify what you want to age by. So if you want to age by invoice date or by due date, of course, it would be by invoice date, again, comparing to your general ledger. And then, of course, you can specify what type of report you want. So summary is pretty much just going to give you the vendor name and the balances that currently exist for that vendor, any balances you still owe to that vendor as of this date up to, and it will show you, excuse me, it will show you those balances per aging period. So it will consolidate all of your invoice balances and credit balances per aging period. Now, of course, if we're running a detail report, it will actually show you those individual invoice numbers and credit memo numbers that are making up those vendor balances. Again, still splitting them out between those aging periods. Talking about these aging periods, of course, these are based on the aging periods that are set up in system settings, but you can change these as needed. So if you wanted to change these every 20 days or anything like that, that is completely up to you. And then, of course, you can specify what you want to include in this report. By default, invoices, credits, and payments are all included. But if you just wanted to look at invoices or just look at credits and payments, that's completely up to you as well. And of course, you have your order by options. Of course, you do have the ability to order by a little bit more if you are running a detail report. So if you are just running a summary, you only have these two options, company and vendor ID. And then this last part down here, transactions voided after date up to will not be included in the report. This is checked by default. Again, when running this report and comparing to your accounts payable general ledger account, it's important to know that when you void something in Edible Software, you have a void date that you indicate when you void it. I should say specifically under payables, you have a void date that you indicate. So according to Edible, it voided out as of that void date. But according to the general ledger, it basically just took that record out completely. So it was as of the invoice date that it was essentially taken out. So because there is a possibility for a date conflict there, we have added this option so that you would run this report and it would look exactly like the general ledger. It would take those voids and basically treat them as of the invoice date rather than the void date. So, of course, if you wanted to see things voided or take into consideration things voided as of the actual void date, then we would want to go ahead and uncheck that. But again, this is checked by default, and not too many people I know really need that unchecked, but that's just there. And then, of course, the currency, if you are running our Forex module, you'll want to make sure that you are running whichever currency you want to see in. Otherwise, of course, you can print this, preview it, or export it to Excel. So just to show you really quickly what the report looks like, this, of course, is the detail. So this is showing me my vendor up here at the top and their basic information, net due days, and all that. And then it's showing me the invoice and credit memo, excuse me, invoice and credit memos below. And then of course it'll give me a subtotal for that vendor. So that is the detail. And then again, the summary is just showing me totals per vendor. So here's just my totals per vendor and then my total down at the bottom. So again, whether you're running for detail or summary, if you're comparing to your accounts payable and you have not chosen to filter anything out, then this should match your accounts payable. If it does not, then we'll want to see why that is. All right. So moving on from there, we get into AP productivity report. So this report is really to show you how you have been handling your payments. So this will look at, payment dates. So that's what this date range is looking at, is payment dates. And again, you can filter by vendors or by vendor groups if you wanted to specify. And then, of course, you have different order options by vendor, then check number and credit memo number, vendor and invoice, vendor and days to pay, days early. So all of these options you'll see when we preview this report. But this is essentially what the report looks like. It is showing you the vendor ID, the invoice or credit memo number. It's showing you the terms for that individual document. So, of course, it'll give you the invoice date and the due date based on the terms. Just the basic invoice or invoice or credit memo, information, and then it will show you whatever payment type was made. So here's the check number that was applied to. Here's the check number that was applied to that invoice, or a manual check, or a wire transfer, or open check. And then over here, it'll give you your payment date and your payment amount. So this gives you your days to pay, and this will give you your days early or late. So if you see anything in parentheses, it means that you were early on the payment, which is good. So we are pretty much early on all of these payments. And so, of course, it'll give you your totals down at the bottom. But that is essentially what this report is. It's basically just showing you your payments and how well you are doing on your payments. If you're late on anything, if you are early on things, so you can kind of keep track of that. And then I believe down here at the bottom, a lot of our AP reports do include a legend down at the bottom to indicate what certain letters mean. So of course, P is a printed check, M is a manual check, wire transfer, O is a open check, and then C, of course, is applied to a credit memo. Okay, so that's pretty much it. And of course, you have the ability to print or export that to Excel as well. All right, moving forward, bank reconciliation. We somewhat talked about in a previous training of ours when we were talking about check reconciliation. However, just to re-go through this, it is simply a report showing you what your bank looks like as far as your edible calculation, as far as your general ledger is concerned, as of a certain date. So this would be compared to your actual bank statement that you get. You would run it as of the same statement date. And when I click run, it's going to give me my balance for my general ledger and my balance for my bank statement. So those should match. Those should match. The major difference is the outstanding checks and outstanding deposits. So again, this is just for reporting purposes. So here, I haven't done any deposits or any payments of any kind from customers. So that is, of course, why I'm in the negative. So I'm not about to go bankrupt. Don't worry. But here I can see any outstanding checks that I may have. And I can preview that list of checks here. So here I have one wire transfer that I have not reconciled to my bank account yet. And that is basically what is keeping me from being in balance. So as long as my balance per my general ledger and my balance for my bank statement match, and they match the physical bank statement that you have, then you are good to go. Excuse me. All right, moving forward, the check register. So the check register is a way of keeping track of your check numbers. So we can print the report by check number or by GL account. We can filter by vendor, of course, if we only wanted to see vendors for checks for specific vendors. Of course, we can also specify a specific bank account, whatever bank account we took out of. We can just run checks for that particular bank account. EFT payment types, again, this is only if you are running the electronic funds transfer module. So you can specify the type of electronic fund that we are looking at. From there, we can specify a check range if that makes it easier. So if you wanted to see a list of checks that you know you printed, you can go from this check number to that check number, or you can go from check date to check date. So here I'm just going to backdate this a little bit. Of course, you can sort by check number or by dollar value amount. And then, of course, on the right side, we have some other filter options. We can say, out of all of this information, I only want to see outstanding checks, so checks that have not been reconciled to my bank yet, or I only want to see reconciled checks. And from there, I even have I have another filter option to run by reconciliation date instead. I also have what types of checks I can choose. So out of outstanding reconciled, I can also specify I only want to show AP checks, I only want to show sundry checks, or I only want to show EFT payments. And then, of course, the last bit down here is what kind of report am I running. So the summary will only show you the check, the check information, check date, amount, everything like that. The detail is going to show you the invoices that were applied to those checks, and the remittance detail is basically by the vendor. So just to show you each of those, and of course, again, you have the ability to print or preview or export this to Excel. But this is the summary. So again, it's based on the check number. It's just showing you the basic information, who is the payee or the vendor. And of course, that would be the remit to name if you guys had a separate remit to name for that particular vendor. It will show you the check date, check amount, the status, void or reconciliation date, and then check type. So of course, again, down here we have, let me just maximize that really quickly. We have a legend to show us what all of these options mean. So V for V is a voided check, of course. R is reconciled. Check type. Check type is C for a regular check, M for a manual check, O for an open check, S for a sundry check, excuse me, and P for a customer refund check. Okay, and then of course it gives you your summary information down at the bottom. Now, of course, again, detail will show you all of that same information, but it will give you the invoice numbers that this was applied to, or that were applied, that this check was applied to as well. All right, so that is basically that. And again, it will give you your summary information at the very bottom. And the last one, the remittance detail, again, is doing a page break per vendor. So it's very similar to the detail type, but it is going by vendor and giving a page break in between. All right. So again, that is the check register. It's just helping you keep track of your check numbers. All right. Again, we're going to skip consignment liquidation today because we are going to be talking about that next week. All right, so inventory claims. Unfortunately, I don't have any inventory claims in this particular database. But essentially what this is showing you is what claims exist in the system and the status of them. So of course there are closed and there are open claims. Claims, of course, we saw in our purchasing training. You can insert a claim for a line item on a purchase order at the time of receiving. You can see that claim when you are creating the payable invoice. And at any given point, you can mark that claim as open or closed. Essentially, it's just a claim note, and we can keep track of that status in the system. But that's basically it. So in here, of course, based on the claim date or based on the date receive date of the line or lot number, it will show you any claims that exist between that date range. It will give you the lot information, vendor, PO number, receive date, item information, and then give you the status of that claim. All right, so that is basically that as far as the inventory claims. Invoice register, basically the same idea as far as the check in regards to the check register. The only difference, of course, is this is for your invoices. So we can filter by a lot of the same information. We can filter by vendor group, or by GL account. We can choose an invoice date range. And then we can specify what we want to include. So do we just want to look at inventory invoices? So invoices that reference a inventory purchase order. Do I also want to see my inventory credit memos and then just exclude non-inventory information? And then, of course, voided invoices and credit memos. So I can choose between all of these what I want to include on this report. Of course, I can print by or group by vendor ID or GL account, and then I can order by invoice number or date of entry. And then, of course, I can choose to exclude audited invoices and credit memos if I wish to. Of course, remember that audit feature is just a excuse me. That audit feature is just a flag that you can choose to say this invoice has been audited or not audited. But just to show you, this is pretty much what we are seeing in this report. So we have our vendor, and then we have all of our invoices and credit memos underneath that vendor, and just gives you the basic information for that invoice. So very similar to the report that we saw earlier as far as like your age payables and your details. It's just showing that information. And of course, giving a subtotal for each vendor, and then giving a complete report total at the back. All right. Outstanding payables, of course, is very similar to your aged payables. The major difference, though, is we are not including payment periods or anything like, or we're not considering aging periods or anything like that. Pretty much, if there is an open balance, we are showing that open balance. So, again, you can filter by vendors or by vendor groups. You can choose a date up to or a due date in between. So again, this is based on the due date. So I can say due date between or date up to. So of course, if I choose due date between, it will only consider invoices with a due date between these dates. If I do date up to, it will consider everything that has a balance with a due date up to that certain date. So report type, of course, summary again is pretty much just going to be based on the vendor and give you that entire amount. And then the detail is going to show you the individual invoices. So just to show you, here I have my vendors. It gives you my total amounts that I still owe and gives me my vendor balance. And then, of course, if I show details, that will give me my individual invoice records. All right. And then, of course, this is splitting it up as far as invoice and payment number. It'll give me the due date. It will give me the amount. It'll give me my paid amount as of, but it'll still give me my open balance as of that date. And then, of course, my report total down at the bottom. Other ways that you can run this report, of course, you can group by vendor if you wanted to, so you wouldn't have to see each individual invoice laid out like that if it's a little bit easier to see the vendor and then the invoices underneath. You can order by vendor, invoice number, date, due date, or vendor name. You can exclude transactions voided after the report date. So again, we have that option there. The only difference is this one is not checked or flagged by default. And again, if you are running our Forex module, then you want to specify, are we running this report based on our home currency or by the original currency of the vendor? And then if we are running by that, are we running the actual foreign exchange rates at the time of receiving the inventory, or are we running foreign exchange rates effective as of today? So those are just some other options for running that report. All right, vendor 1099. So when we talked about the vendor master file, I did show you that you could mark certain vendors as vendor 1099s. So if this is a 1099 vendor, which unfortunately I don't have any in the system right now, you could choose that 1099 vendor. You can choose check dates. I'll have to get that fixed. Check dates between this date range, and then of course you can specify that. Of course is more for the report. You can sort by vendor ID and vendor name, and click print or preview, and that will show you the report. So that's the summary report. And then, of course, the 1099 is actually the 1099 form that you can print out, and we have it formatted to match the 1099 tax form. So you can print the 1099 tax form, or you can get a summarized total and report for that vendor. So that is up to you which report type you want to run. Vendor address labels are pretty straightforward. You can print out vendor address labels to put on purchase orders or anything like that if you wanted to. They are coded specifically to these Avery 5160 labels. So these are labels that you actually load into a laser printer, and it will print out the vendor address information on those labels. You can print them for all vendors. You can print them for certain groups of vendors and select which groups. You can select specific vendors that you want to print these address labels for. You can select vendors and print 30 labels, or you can select the vendor and specify how many labels you want to print. So again, completely up to you how you want to print these labels, if you do want to print these labels. And then this option right here, capitalize name and addresses. This is just making sure perhaps you entered in the vendor really quickly and didn't capitalize certain information in the vendor master file. Checking this will just make sure that that information is capitalized so it looks a little bit more pretty. Vendor invoice allocation. So this, of course, is going to show us invoices, excuse me, between this date range. Again, we can filter by vendor. So the summary is just going to show us the invoice number, the invoice date, and the amount. So pretty straightforward. And then, of course, if we show detail, we are actually going to see the purchase orders that the purchase orders that fall into those invoices or that were applied to those invoices. So here is this invoice, and it was applied to this purchase order and all of these line items. So I did slightly misspeak. It's not just the purchase orders that fit into that invoice, although that is it. It is also showing you the line items on that invoice, or sorry, the line items on that particular PO that feed into that invoice. And I'll show you the item code, receive quantity, amount, everything that you need from this report. And then again, it gives you your total at the back. Okay, So vendor ledger should match exactly what we saw when we talked about the vendor master file in the accounting tab. So it's showing you a lot of the same information. Excuse me. Uh, of course, you can specify to show print this out for a specific vendor if you want to. You can look at transaction dates, so set a transaction date range. And then, of course, you can choose which transactions you want to see. Do I want to see invoices, payments and open checks, discounts and adjustments, credits and voids? So, again, I can choose between all of these, but essentially, this is what we will see when we run this. It will just show me my vendor, and it will show me all of my documents or transactions with dates fitting between that date range. And of course, it will show me my amount, my the amount of that, or the original amount of that document, and then it'll show me my current balance and a reference number if that, and of course it'll give you a subtotal per vendor and then a grand total at the back. Vendor licenses and certificates. So of course this is just going to show you any vendor that has a license and certificate. It's actually going to show you all vendors depending on what you are listing in the report. So all vendors will just show you vendors. Will just show you all vendors. It will include license and certificate information uh, if there is any to show. So just to show you really quickly what that would look like. This, I see all of my vendors. So as you can see, none of my vendors actually have a certificate or a license entered in. Again, that was entered in under the vendor master file under the license and certificate tab. Of course, I can specify I only want to see vendors with certifications or see vendors without certifications. So there's different ways that you can run this report. So here, of course, since I don't have any vendors that have certifications, it's pretty much just kind of blipped at the top, indicating that I do not have any certifications right now. And of course, this is just options that you to see what you want to show on the report: vendor name, vendor ID, license and certificate, issue date, expiration date, everything like that. So pretty straightforward report. Vendor list. This is, of course, a report that will show you a list of your vendors and their information, depending on what you want to show. So again, here are all of our filter options by vendor, by group, by type, by state that the vendor belongs to. We can also filter by vendors and their expense accounts. So we can specify an expense account, and it will only show vendors tied to that expense account. If they have certificate information, we can specify that. We can specify the summary, which is pretty much just going to show you the basic vendor information. So here, just to show you that, this is just showing you the vendor, the company, or the vendor name, contact name, title, phone, fax, and cell. And then if I chose detail, it would show me a little bit more information. I can specify. I just want to print active vendors. I also want to print food safety vendors. So food safety, of course, is a flag that exists on the vendor master file. So let me take that off, and now I can see all my vendor information. So here it just kind of expands. So instead of just the contact information, now we have the address, city, state, and zip. We have terms, expense account, and all that good stuff. And then we can go even further and specify, well, I want to see my vendor information and include their standard item or whatever is in their vendor list. So here, if I wanted to see the item information, I can choose to show active items, active UOM, and I could say only show standard items, or I can take that off and it will show me any items that exist for that vendor. So here I have my vendor information at the top, and then it will show me my items that belong to that vendor right here. So that is basically that. And then it will show you any items, excuse me, it will show you any items that exist on that vendor list, and it will specify if it is a standard item or not. All right. The last report is the vendor profitability by load. So I don't have a lot of information in here because, again, I haven't done as much on the receivable side. But just to show you, I did set up a couple of load IDs when I was doing the purchasing training. So I'll just go ahead and leave this at all, but it will show you all of your load IDs that exist in the system. And here I will say open and in progress. I'll click preview. So here I can see the vendors that belong, all the vendors that belong to that load ID, and it will tell me the number of lots, the number of lots on that load. It will show me the number of master counts, and total sales, total cost, and my profitability. So essentially, it's very much like the vendor profitability by purchase order or the PO profitability report. Of course, it is by load ID instead. So it will be consolidating all of the purchases on that assigned to that load. But that is basically it. All right. So that is, of course, our AP reports. So again, it was a pretty quick training today. If you have any questions or want a little bit more information on any of these reports, let us know. Send us an email or send us a chat before we hang up today, and we will be happy to walk through that with you on a one-to-one basis. Otherwise, thank you again for joining me. I hope you learned something or found it at least remotely interesting. And I will see you next week when we talk about consignment liquidation. Have a great rest of your week, and I'll see you then. Bye.